Welcome everyone to this webinar. It's timely. The lessons so far, the role of sustainable bioenergy in displacing fossil fuels. Challenging times, and we have COP26 now really only a matter of weeks away. The panel today is august. Their excellence will be, I think, apparent from their contributions. But in truth, the difficulties faced by the wider world are significant. What I'd like to talk about very briefly, if I may, are just some of the things which need to be picked out. I think the first thing is that a lot of people just don't really understand what biofuels or biomass or bioenergy actually is. And I think there is a disconnect between the wider public and those who perhaps might be joining this webinar. And that needs to be closed because biomass biofuels are integral and essential to the future of our planet and to our ability to manage carbon in the atmosphere. Some of the issues that we will need to think about today that need to be resolved to the satisfaction of the wider public concern the nature of the forests themselves. And this is often linked to the nature question, biodiversity. The question of the supply chain, where are these forests and how do the products get from the forest onwards? And then the real question, of course, as well, is that biomass itself needs to be combined with some form of capture, some form of emissions capture itself to be neutral. I should introduce myself. I'm Ian Duncan. I was a member of the European Parliament, and my focus there was initially on climate change, with a particular focus on emissions. And subsequent to that, I joined the UK government, and I was a minister in a number of departments, laterally as the climate change minister. And I attended as a minister at the last two COP gatherings, having attended them previously as a member of the European Parliament. So let me just again introduce one of my colleagues who will be on the panel today, Christian Rakos, who is the president of the World Bioenergy Association. And he is a physicist by training, which I suspect will be a useful discipline, founding president of the European Pellet Association. So I'm going to bring him on now to say a few words, and then we'll begin the event. So I'm going to bring you on now, Christian.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for chairing this session and welcome to you all on behalf of the World Bioenergy Association. Our association is a membership organization with about 200 companies, associations, and also individuals that are all interested and engaged in bioenergy. Our commitment as an association is to promote the sustainable use of bioenergy. And saying so, we acknowledge not all use of bioenergy is automatically sustainable. There is very significant amounts of bioenergy use, particularly traditional use of bioenergy, of firewood for cooking, for heating, that is not sustainable because it is collecting too much wood is being collected, pollution is being produced, people are getting sick from the smokes. Modern bioenergy is a way of using bioenergy in a clean way, in a way that does not pollute the environment and that is sustainable because there is a balance between supply and demand. Our commitment as an association is to promote international learning. So we have participants in our association across all continents, and there is a lot of knowledge to be gained to improve bioenergy use to a level where it is sustainable. And that leads me to the controversy about bioenergy use, because we are very aware that there is a lot of controversy, especially about large-scale bioenergy use. And looking at it, of course, you may be concerned if you know that lots and lots of wood is used in these bioenergy conversion systems. And you may think, oh, is there enough? Are we taking properly care of? There is a need to look at sustainability, and we're doing that. We're very much aware of this, and we're taking up this challenge to prove that it can be done in a sustainable way. We often hear claims that forests are being burned for energy, and it will take decades for them to regrow. And I would like to shortly address these two claims because there's a lot of misunderstanding in this. I dare say forests are not being harvested anywhere in the world for energy, because the true value in a forest is the stem wood that is useful for producing saw logs, and that is about 3 to 4 times more expensive than the energy wood, which is wood that cannot be used to produce saw logs. So no forest owner anywhere will simply cut down a forest to use it for energy. It's not being done. Second point, sustainably managed forests do not take decades to regrow. They regrow, you could say, instantly, because there is a permanent balance between what you take out and what is growing. In Austria, my home country, 100,000 cubic meters of wood are growing every day. So if we are harvesting 100,000 cubic meters today, they will be replaced tomorrow. So there is no long-term carbon debt, as has been suggested over and over again, as long as we have this balance of supply and demand. Our industry is working right now on a clear and ambitious commitment towards sustainability. We want to publish that in the context of COP26, please look out for that. We are working very intensively to make a credible commitment, and we are working very intensively to make our contribution to climate change. So thank you very much, and with that I'll give back the word to Ian Duncan.
Thank you very much, Christian. What we have coming up, we have 2 presentations, one broadly looking at how do we get here, if you like, the journey so far, and the other looking at a case study within the United Kingdom. So what I'm going to do is call upon the first speaker, who will be Luke Pelkmans, who is from the International Energy Agency. Now, again, Luke is a technical coordinator and has a background broadly in research. So you should be able to find on your screen now his presentation, and I'm going to call Luke to speak, and he's going to speak for 10 minutes. So Luke, over to you. I hope.
Okay, I had to unmute myself and couldn't find the button anymore. So let's see. So thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to give this presentation, so this background presentation for the webinar, which is looking into sustainable bioenergy and industries and how we are replacing fossil fuels, and also the points of attention and the lessons that we had so far. Just some background on IEA Bioenergy. We are a technology collaboration program functioning within a framework created by the IEA. So we're not representing the IEA itself, but we are a network on our own. And we have 26 member countries from all over the world. So it's actually more the administrations and the policy levels who are member, and then we have experts in the field working together on these different things. Just about taking a step back on what is the unique role of sustainable bioenergy. So we recognize that there are different types of renewable energy, but there are quite some specifics also which are typical for bioenergy, which is that it is available now, so we can use it already, and it's also versatile. So it can be used in different sectors. It can be used to produce heat, to produce power, to produce transport fuels, or combinations of the different types of products. It can be integrated with existing infrastructure. It can use existing assets also to directly replace fossil fuels. It's storable, so in that sense, it can also support intermittent renewables, which you can't control so much on when they produce their energy. So you can actually have a good synergy with those. And in future, also bioenergy can lead to net extraction of atmospheric CO2, which is called negative emissions then when you link it to carbon capture and storage. So you capture the CO2 and you put it under the ground. There's a lot of discussions, as Christian has mentioned, about how does it contribute to climate change mitigation, but it really does under a number of conditions. First is that the biomass harvest fits within sustainable land or forest management, or if it's based on waste and residues, which you typically have when you harvest for products. Second is if it's converted to energy products efficiently, so it's still a limited resource, so we have to make the most of it. Often it's also a co-product of biomaterials. And a third point is also that you want to displace greenhouse gas intensive fuels with it. So you don't want to have competition with other renewables, but you want to focus on places where there are still fossil fuels with high greenhouse gas emissions. Just looking at the overall picture of how total energy supply at the global level is evolving. I'm not going into detail, but what you see actually is that the three in the bottom, which is coal, which is crude oil, and which is natural gas, they're still expanding. So no matter what discussions we have and alarm bells there are, at the global level, they are still growing. And that's an important message. On the top, you see bioenergy in green, which is actually the dominant type of renewable energy for quite a long time. It still is, but of course it also includes traditional use of biomass, and that's something we want to get rid of, and you want to replace it with modern bioenergy. But it is, and sometimes forgotten, it is actually the dominant type of renewable energy. And the most important type of biomass being used is actually solid biofuels. So you have solid biofuels, you have gaseous biofuels, biogas, and liquid biofuels, which are mostly used in transport, but dominant is actually solid biofuels. On the left, you see the amount of solid biofuels being used at the global level, but I divided it between OECD countries and non-OECD countries, so the developing world. You see a very big consumption in developing world, and a lot of it is for what we call residential consumption, but most of that is really traditional use of biomass. So that's a big chunk of that. If you look at the OECD, you can actually divide it in three categories. So first category is the amount which is used for power and heat consumption. So actually producing heat and electricity that are sold. Then you have industry consumption, so industry using it as a fuel. And then you also have residential consumption in the OECD world. It's kind of split between those three in the middle. If you then focus on the industry part and the energy production part, also for the two parts, OECD and non-OECD, you see kind of a mix here in different categories. Actually, the biggest block here is the biomass being used in pulp and paper industries to produce energy. So that's actually quite dominant in the OECD countries. Another half is used for electricity and heat production in these, kind of split between either electricity only installations, CHP installations, and also split between auto production, so companies producing electricity and heat for their own use in CHP installation, or activity producers which are actually producing electricity and heat to put on the market. So you see they're kind of mixed. For non-OECD, it's a different situation. You see much more here in the bottom. You see much more auto production from electricity, so using biomass, which they have to produce electricity for their own use. And you also see other industries. So it's not so much focused on pulp and paper industries in developing world, but it's more broadly. And yeah, for non-OECD countries, you see in the left here, a very high demand for residential use, traditional bioenergy, but also the black one here for charcoal production. I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the conclusions we had in a few workshops. We had in 2019 and 2020, which were actually focused on industry applications. So we had a physical workshop still in 2019 in Estonia on developing business models for efficient use of biomass. And then last year, so a few months ago, we had a virtual workshop on the contribution of sustainable biomass and bioenergy in industry transitions. I just want to highlight a few of the conclusions and the learnings that we had in these workshops. It's a little bit too much text here, but I think this kind of summarizes some of the conclusions on biomass in industry. So we see that there is already quite a lot. So there's quite some fuel technology combinations which are commercial for producing power and heat in industry. and quite a lot of successful examples that industries can rely on biomass to produce the heat that they require internally. Now, what we see so far, what is most common is the pulp and paper industry, wood processing industries, food industries, using their own process residues for their heat requirements and electricity requirements. So that's most common, and that's also most cost competitive. So if you have the residues already, you don't have to buy them from external source, so that's also easier and quite cost competitive. Now, if you want to have a further deployment in industry, you need to go beyond that. So you need to go look into the market. Yeah, where is biomass? Can we buy it? In what conditions can we buy it? And in that sense, the low cost of fossil fuels, which we still have, is quite a big challenge still. If you look into the type of industries, if you have small, medium-sized industries and the heat amount that they have, very often you can really match that with the biomass resources that you have available at a local or regional scale. So that's really an advantage of these kinds of industries, that they don't need to have a big amounts of biomass that you have to source from all over the world. So they can look really at the local and regional level. And looking at the opportunities then for different industries is you really have to look at the local situation, the site-specific situation where you have specific feedstock availability, a specific technology can fit for that. So these optimal combinations are very site-specific, and you need to carefully assess them. If you look into large energy-intensive industries like steel industries, cement industries, they're actually looking for so much fuel, so much coal at the moment, and fossil fuels. Replacing that entirely with biomass is really a bottleneck. So the size of their consumption is really huge. So that's quite a big issue to get access to that kind of these amounts of biomass. So they also have to look for combinations with other solutions like electrification, hydrogen, CCS, to reduce the carbon footprint in their sector. Another workshop was more about business models. So if you want to have further deployment of bioenergy at a global level, business models are really crucial. So you need to have economically viable and bankable business models. Now, you have to consider all things to get to this business model, and one of the crucial parts is really mobilization of biomass resources. So that's really a crucial prerequisite in the business model. So you have to consider the cost of your feedstock. You have to consider the diversity of the feedstock, so it's not all the same quality. Supply security, can you contract it? As well as, and that's getting more and more important also, is the sustainability governance of the feedstock that you want to acquire. So they all need to be considered as in your successful business model. And what we see as quite interesting developments also is and things with quite a lot of potential is kind of an intermediate, like biohubs, which are providing feedstock collection and an intermediate pretreatment and storage, which then can be an interface between the supply chain and the markets that they serve. So it can also link to trading platforms. Now, the availability of biomass overall, so we can still extend it, but it is limited. So towards the future, you have to do the most of it. You have to make the most of it. So value creation from the biomass is really in focus. So you have to look at a mix of technologies, a mix of products that you can make, which is actually quite common practice in petroleum refineries. So it's really getting the most of it. What is quite important also towards the future is that any advantage in terms of sustainability, and it's mostly climate which is in focus now, that should be reflected in a market value or in market access. So you need to have some credit, some value of the CO2 that you save. Certainly if you go towards negative CO2 emissions because you're putting other effort into to reduce CO2, you need to get a credit for that. Or you need to have a specific market access that certain markets say, well, we don't want to go for fossil fuels anymore, or we want to reduce it. So the only thing we take extra is renewable. Not surprisingly, you need a stable policy framework, and also for early market introduction, you need to have risk abatement, risk sharing mechanisms, which are important. And a good advice also to initiatives is try to communicate and engage local communities. Certainly if you're starting from regional biomass, if you have a regional initiative, sharing benefits and sharing ownership can really be a powerful way to deal with local resistance. And of course, you also have to deal with local concerns like air quality, so having the lowest emissions as you can. I'm not sure of how far I am in time, because this part is more towards the future. I can stop if you like, and otherwise I can say a few words about this scenario.
Your time is actually just up, which was perfect
okay.
timing. So I think it may well be that some who are on the call would enjoy the slides, which you might be able to share later.
Yes,
but
I will share the slides, and you can also have a look into the role of bioenergy in this net zero by 2050 roadmap. So,
well, thank you, Luke. That was very helpful indeed. We're going to move on now to the next speaker, who's going to take us into a particular case study in the United Kingdom. So the next speaker is Ross Mackenzie. I know Ross Mackenzie well. He is the Group Head of Public Affairs and Government Policy at Drax, and he once worked for one of the leading MEPs in the European Parliament. But I will say no more than that, and I will just simply say, Ross, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. And for the avoidance of doubt for everybody on the line, Ian was referring to himself there. So I'll leave you all to draw your own conclusions from that while I share my screen. I hope you can all see that. You may not be able to just yet because I haven't pressed the button. There we go. And I hope that is now shareable. Please do shout, Ian, if it's not. So thank you very much for having me on. I'm here to tell the story of Drax, which is one of the last and largest coal-fired power station that was ever built in the United Kingdom. And it's a great time to be talking to you today about the story of Drax, because the government has just published or just updated its target date for phasing out coal from the United Kingdom altogether. By 2024, there will be no more coal-fired power operating in the United Kingdom. And that's a story that we're seeing time and time again throughout the world as we look to meet our climate targets, that governments are first and foremostly, and rightly so, targeting fossil fuels and starting off with coal. Now, around 15 years ago, Drax, which supplies around 6 million British homes and businesses with electricity, realised that coal really had no place in the UK's power system. And since then, we've been on a fairly unique, I think, journey, transforming the power station from the biggest emitter in Western Europe to one of the largest decarbonisation projects in Europe. And that really began, as I say, around 15 years ago, when our engineers tried to start displacing some of the fossil carbon coming out of the Drax Power Station with coal-firing biomass. And we went around the world and we started trialing different fuels and feedstocks, from peanut husks to bagasse to pellets, you name it. And we eventually settled on miscanthus for a while as an energy crop. But then suddenly the government decided that coal firing wasn't the way it wanted to go. And Drax, we had to pivot towards a fuller conversion of the power station. And today, 90% of the electricity produced at the Drax Power Station is renewable from sustainably sourced bioenergy. That's an 80% saving on the CO2 from coal. And it's also enabling us to look forward into the future towards negative emissions as well, which I'll come on to. But the first lesson I think that we can draw from the sort of Drax experience is really that decarbonisation is always going to be a partnership between industry and government. Drax wouldn't have been able to convert from coal to bioenergy if it hadn't been for successive UK governments' commitment to renewable energy, to phasing out coal, and also to carbon pricing. So the UK probably has the most successful coal phase-out program in the world. It's developed mechanisms like the contract for difference model, this investable, legally binding contract that it enters into with energy providers to ensure that renewable power is rewarded at a certain level to make it investable, to build out big projects. And you can see since 2013, the UK's coal consumption has dropped by something remarkable like 80%, whereas the development of offshore wind, bioenergy and other renewables has just increased exponentially. And I think that's a huge lesson for any country or any company around the world looking to see whether or not they can follow that model, is that it has to be done in partnership with government, with the policy support there and the investable and the willingness to invest of operators as well. I think the second lesson that we certainly learned is that actually in some coal-fired power stations like Drax, it's not actually that difficult to replace coal with biomass. One of the great benefits that we all know about bioenergy is that it acts like a fossil fuel, but it is of course renewable. So bioenergy can be turned up and down, it's dispatchable, it actually helps integrate other renewables by producing electricity when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. But the real challenge that we faced was actually building a global supply chain. And you can see here from this slide just how many components there are to that supply chain. It really hadn't been done before Drax did it. So a lot of the investment and a lot of the time and energy was spent trying to find the best location for the biomass, trying to find the best and most efficient, as Luke was talking about earlier, the best and most efficient way of building that supply chain. Infrastructure played a large part in that, and part of what we were able to bring to the UK was a substantial investment in the ports that take our bioenergy before it comes into the Drax Power Station. So we have 4 principal ports: Hull, Immingham, Liverpool and Tyne. All of those got multi-million-pound investments to take in the pellets to Drax Power Station, and all of that created jobs. And that's a really proud partnership that we have built with these key ports and key suppliers, and something that we're proud of is to be able to reinvest that sort of infrastructure money in the UK economy. The other part of the infrastructure puzzle was really the rail optimization. If you are taking coal into a power station, it's okay to lump it onto any old train wagon where it can get rained on, snowed on, you name it. But biomass is clearly different. It needs to be protected specially. So we had to build 225 bespoke British-made biomass wagons that could safely transport the bioenergy from the port to the power station. We get around 14 deliveries of that a day, 20,000 tons arriving at Drax from Mondays to Saturdays. So it's an incredibly efficient, lean machine, and it's all something that had to be built from scratch to get us to where we are today. I think it's been mentioned by Christian in the beginning and touched on as well by Ian. Sustainability is at the heart of what we do. I think the third lesson I would certainly like to draw upon is being able not just to rely on theories of sustainability, not relying on the science as we understand it today, but actually being able to verify, to prove, to demonstrate, to always invest and endeavor to do more to show that the impact that you are having in your sourcing areas is a positive one, that you are mitigating the risks that come with bioenergy, because of course any resource use is not inherently sustainable. It's got to be demonstrated. So at Drax, we source the majority of our bioenergy from the Southeast US, that Gulf of Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas. And we do so for many reasons. First of all, the working forest, the sustainably managed working forest, not all of the forest, but the working forests in those areas are 3 times the landmass of the entire United Kingdom. There is a very well established forestry industry there. and it is incredibly well regulated as well. And those three components make it an ideal sourcing location for Drax, because you can tap into an existing market that is well regulated and where there is an abundance of that residues and waste that we can use to turn into bioenergy, instead of what was a common practice, discarding it at roadside or burning it. It also has a healthy sawmill industry, processing industry from which we can take. And again, around 40–50%, it fluctuates of the feedstock that Drax takes isn't direct from a forest at all. It's actually the shavings from making 2x4s, furniture, buildings, all of these high carbon lock-in products that help replace fossil fuels. And we can see what's happening to these forests quite well. We had a study done a few years ago, and this is one of the primary results, which looks at the removals from the US South forests, the growth of the US South forests, and the inventory stored within them. And you can see quite a high correlation there. Removals, meaning harvests of those forests, have increased. And that's massively due to urbanization, the demand for wooden products, telephone poles, furniture, building materials to help grow US towns and cities throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s up to the present day has meant that harvesting has increased in the US South. However, what we can see almost counterintuitively is that the growth in those forests has also increased. And the inventory in those forests, the carbon stored in those forests, has also increased. And that's because there has been a positive forest response. That investment in growing more trees and maintaining healthy forests from the demand for wooden products, of which bioenergy, by the way, is a very small part. About 0.1% of all of the US's forest inventory is turned into pellets for bioenergy. But looking at that positive forest response, we can get some assurance of sustainability. But it's certainly not the last thing that we do. And a couple of years ago, Drax refreshed its responsible sourcing policy to really try and clarify and sharpen our commitments around this area. So you can see on the screen there, number one, we will reduce CO2 emissions, and that's not just by displacing coal through using bioenergy, as important as that is. That's really looking at the feedstocks of bioenergy that we use and the circumstances in which we will take feedstocks from harvest, and being quite committed to the latest available science in that space to ensure that we're delivering the best carbon outcome in the forest. Protecting the natural environment. There's some great legislation in the US around water and air quality, but it's also about having our sustainability foresters on the ground, looking at the specifics of harvesting areas and making very bespoke determinations on how to protect watercourses, how to protect the wildlife that's in those forests, how to sensitively manage that to ensure that you aren't harming biodiversity. Supporting people and communities. It's no secret that some of the poorest communities are in the southeast of the US, in Louisiana and Mississippi, and quite often we provide a vital role there as a creator and sustainer of jobs, particularly where pulp and paper mills that have been in decline have left the region. And we absolutely are committed to helping support those communities. We've seen that quite recently through some of the storms that have been happening in Louisiana and COVID, where Drax has played a very proactive role in supporting its communities. And the last but no means least of our commitments is investing in research, outreach and intervention. It was the UK government's Committee on Climate Change that said that sustainability is not something you can ever just attain and it stands still. It's always an ongoing journey. And I think if we were looking back over the last sort of 5 years of large-scale bioenergy being in operation, we would have sought to put this type of criteria very clearly at the top of our agenda a lot earlier to be able to demonstrate our impact in the forests. The last lesson I'm going to touch on is around the role really of bioenergy. And It started out for Drax certainly as a way to prolong the span of the plant and the thousands and thousands of very important jobs that are connected to keeping Drax going and keeping the lights on in the United Kingdom. But actually, as the electricity grid has changed and adapted to a higher amount of intermittent renewables, wind and solar, higher amounts of consumer control, more instability and variability in the way the power system operates, bioenergy's role has grown and grown and grown. And I think, again, this is a great lesson for other countries across the world that are going to start investing heavily in more renewables, is that you will need that stable thermal dispatchable source of electricity. And bioenergy does become more important over time in that regard. And it also becomes even more vital for the climate when we look towards negative emissions. And at Drax, we are trialing a pioneering negative emissions technology. We're working with partners such as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Shell, Sea Capture, and others, and working as part of a cluster of emitting organisations in the Humber region in the northeast of England, to try and create the world's first negative emissions plant at scale, where we could capture up to 8 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, generating negative emissions and permanently removing that biogenic carbon from the atmosphere. So there we are. My lessons from Drax are that decarbonisation is a partnership between government and industry. The supply chain has been the huge challenge that we faced, and bioenergy is a good substitute for coal in coal-fired power plants like ours. A stable investment framework, a commitment from government is absolutely essential for large-scale projects to succeed. Sustainability is key. Track, trace, and verify right from the start. Don't rely on assumptions. Biomass can complement wind and solar, and it becomes more important over time. And the debate is changing from simply displacing coal to generating negative emissions that climate scientists tell us is absolutely vital if we are to keep our 1.5 degree Paris target alive. And with that, and a little bit of time back, I will say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ross. We now move on to the next section, which in fact is a panel discussion. Now, you've heard from two of the panelists already, so you won't be hearing from them in the next moment or two, but we then have three new panelists joining us. So we have Maria Michela Moraes, Seth Ginter, and Jean-Marc Jossart. Maria is the Executive Secretary of Global Bioenergy Partnership. Seth is the Executive Director of the US Industrial Pellet Association, and Jean-Marc is the Secretary General of Bioenergy Europe. And broadly, they've got a couple of minutes just to tell us a little bit more about their context of the lessons of sustainable bioenergy. So let me begin with Maria. Maria, you have a moment or two to set out your arguments.
Thank you very much for your nice introductory. I will share a couple of slides just to highlight a couple of important points. In particular, I hope you may see my screen. Well, in particular, for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Bioenergy Partnership that I represent as the Executive Secretary, the Global Bioenergy Partnership is an international initiative that was established in 2006. And since then, so in the last 15 years, we've been working in order to facilitate a sustainable development of bioenergy. And today we have more than 80 members between governments, mainly governments, and international organizations. FAO of the United Nations is one of the founding partners of the Global Bioenergy Partnership and also hosts its secretariat in the FAO headquarters in Rome. So since the very beginning in the Global Bioenergy Partnership, we've been aware that bioenergy can present excellent opportunities, but not without challenges. And the key fact is to look at sustainability in order to take out the best from the opportunities and face at the utmost the challenges. And so we have developed a set of 24 sustainability indicators that you may see them on the screen. They are 24, 8 under each of the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And these wanted to be an extremely important message in the sense that sustainable development can only be achieved if equal importance is given to the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And of course, you may only see the titles of these indicators, but we have developed a report, which is the cover that you see now on the screen, which contains all the methodologies to measure each of those 24 indicators. Something extremely important is that the results of the measurement of these indicators are important information to be transmitted to policymakers in order for them to take appropriate and informed decisions in terms of policy. And as you may see, all those are covers of reports and studies that have been performed by GBEP partners all over the world in their own countries in order to measure the sustainability of the bioenergy value chain. And then also, well, a lot of work has been done by GBEP in these 15 years in order to improve the sustainability of bioenergy. As I said, in order to take out the best from the opportunities that bioenergy could offer. And if I should just mention a few of the, what we call the GBEP policy heritage, for sure, we have supported the development of the regional strategy on bioenergy of the ECOWAS region, which is the 15 countries in the northwest part of Africa. We implemented the GBEP indicators in several countries, in particular in Indonesia. We recommended the government to pay more attention to the methane capture system of the palm oil mill effluents in order to increase the number of mills equipped with this technology. In Vietnam, we have suggested, for example, the government to insert anaerobic digestion into their INDCs, intended nationally determined contribution, as a method to reduce GHG emissions. In Paraguay, we have realized that a huge number of woody biomass is used, but produced not in a sustainable manner. And we have made a lot of recommendations to the government in order to support, in order to better guide these the wood energy use. And also in Togo and Ghana, we've been working in order to link better the use of wood energy and forest landscape restoration in order also to give alternative uses of biomass in order to reduce the pressure on forests. And we've also been working at the EU level on marginal, underutilized and contaminated lands. So this, in a nutshell, my concentration on sustainable development of bioenergy. Over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to bring in Seth now. So Seth, the floor is now yours.
Great. Thank you, Lord Duncan. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this afternoon. I'm going to follow up on a handful of themes that I think we've already heard today. I'm Seth Ginther, the Executive Director of the U.S. Industrial Pellet Association. We represent producers of sustainable biomass from the southeastern U.S. For export to Europe and Asia. Last year, we exported about 7.5 million metric tons of sustainable biomass to these countries. When we talk about lessons learned and we think about lessons learned, there are certainly a handful as we've been engaged in the industry over the past more than a decade now. I think first and foremost is really the continuous need to educate and to not only tell our story, but to also be able to show and demonstrate what we're doing is sustainable. I think particularly us in the U.S. Southeast, where this abundant natural resource that we have has really been supplying the world with forest products in a sustainable manner since the mid-1950s. Year over year, these wood baskets are increasing. The carbon stocks are increasing. And as we kind of take that for granted, and as we've gone really out into the world to educate others with regard to where the wood fiber is coming from, being able to educate folks on that fact, on the abundance of it, on how much of the natural resource is there, I think also being able to demonstrate to folks that we are using only low-grade wood fiber. Going back to Christian's point at the beginning of the webinar, landowners, particularly in the U.S. Southeast, grow their timber for high-value stem wood that can be used to make houses and furniture and telephone poles and things of that nature. Where our industry comes in, when we go to those logging sites, we are purchasing the low-grade wood fiber that is a byproduct of those harvests. And so, one of the lessons learned, particularly in a pre-COVID era, when we could have policymakers and other stakeholders travel to the U.S. and come into the forest with us and actually see these merchandising sites, see the harvesting taking place, and seeing that high-value stem wood being put in a pile to go directly to a sawmill to be turned into a piece of furniture, and then seeing the low value stuff, the residues, the thinnings, the tops and limbs being purchased by our industry and being taken to the pellet mill for use. Showing is always better than telling. Secondly, I think as the industry began about a decade ago, nothing was harmonized. We were a sustainable natural resource that at that point, from a quality perspective, as well as a sustainability perspective, although there were practices in place, all of those things were not harmonized. And to do the things that we need to do as an industry to truly mitigate climate change, we need to be a true commodity. And in order to be a true commodity, there needs to be harmonization. So being able to come together with other producers from across the globe, customers in the power sector and the heat sector and the residential sector, and setting quality standards so that as a purchaser of this sustainable energy, that no matter where that product is coming from, it is going to meet the same exact quality standards. Very similarly, from a sustainability perspective, as many of you are aware, within RED 1, which was really one of the kind of key pieces of legislation that spurred this industry, there were no sustainability criteria for solid biomass. That's something that as an industry, we went to the EU government and solicited them over a series of years to please enact a harmonized sustainability criteria, because it's very important for people that are turning their lights on in Europe and in other parts of the world to know, to be able to track and trace exactly where that energy is coming from. As folks are aware, RED 2 was passed in 2018. It is just now about to be implemented, and we have a sustainability criteria for solid biomass. We've even gone a step further than regulatory compliance, though. Importantly, there's now a certification scheme in place called the Sustainable Biomass Program that allows for certification of wood baskets and of the mills that are producing industrial pellets and others. And those certifications are independently audited on an annual basis. So again, not only telling, but showing, and being able to show our stakeholders that, there are independent auditors out there in the field on an annual basis, making sure that these supply chains are secure and are in place. So I think, thinking through all of these different issues, the constant need to educate, I think it's very clear also from comments made from everybody on here that we need to continue to follow that journey. And then lastly, I would just note, and have already heard this, today raised, but, there is such thing as doing biomass right and doing biomass wrong, good biomass and quote unquote bad biomass. And I think as an industry, we've really moved forward to not only source good biomass, but to be able to demonstrate and prove to our stakeholders that what we are sourcing is indeed good, and having those certifications, having those audits, having things of that nature documented and being able to show people is very, very important. So Lord Duncan, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about lessons learned from a US perspective in the Southeast. And I look forward to the discussion and conversation.
Thank you, Seth. I've been asked to remind participants that you can type in your questions into the Q&A area. So if you want to do that, they will be the questions which we will then be posing to the other participants. Also, I have a confession to make that I'm about to speak in the Environment Bill. The House of Lords has unexpectedly moved a little bit swifter than anticipated, so I'm going to be passing on my duties, I think, very shortly. But before I do that, let me call the next speaker, who will be Jean-Marc. So Jean-Marc, you will be coming in, and my duties will be taken over probably in my absence. So forgive me for leaving early, which is a bit of a shame. But please be aware that the legislation I'm making is important legislation, I would hope. Rest assured, I'm on the side of good in that regard. So, Jean-Marc, it is your turn to come on board now.
Thank you, Jan Duncan, and we fully trust you to fight for our sectors in the different arenas that you will attend anytime soon. So I'm Jean-Marc Jossel. Indeed, I'm representing Bioenergy Europe, representing the bioenergy industry in Europe. A lot have been said already by the different very good speakers, so I'll try not to be redundant. Indeed, bioenergy is already used by industry today. At the European level, 11% of the energy from industry comes from biomass. Of course, it's mainly the woodworking industry, sawmills, even particle board, criticizing very much biomass, but using themselves a lot of bioenergy, and the pulp and paper industry. For the pulp and paper industry, for example, 60% of the energy comes from biomass. And now with the carbon neutrality vision of Europe, other kinds of industry, and that's what is interesting, other types of industry are also considering, they are forced to consider options for reducing, for decarbonizing the industry, and biomass is one option. And they have to evaluate the positive and negative sides. And I would say that we have some good sets. We have the carbon neutrality, as Christian said, for sustainability, for sustainable forest management. If you have at least a stable carbon stock in the forest, we can definitely consider the carbon neutrality. We can even go to negative carbon emissions. Industry are aware about this. We have flexibility. And you can imagine industries working 24 hours a day. They cannot run with when there is wind or sun only. I mean, this is obvious that the flexibility with the possibility to produce high temperature steam is kind of unique in the renewable energy portfolio that they have, the industry has in front of them. And they are also aware, because there are facts about the carbon stock in the forest, that our potential, both in Europe and in the US, is increasing. So there is a certain confidence that bioenergy will grow. But I would say that we are now at a turning point since, let's say, 2 years, and we'll say the coming months and the coming even the coming 2 years are quite crucial, because we are discussing the Renewable Energy Directive and its update. And there are 2 ways, as far as I see, to see that. Either we see it positively, and we see that the industry is really committing to sustainability. We have criteria that no other sector gets at such kind of mandatory and sustainability criteria by law, and not just voluntary schemes. There are plenty of voluntary labels and certifications, but we would be obliged by law, and Seth mentioned some of the certification schemes that are existing already. And this demonstrates that we have some guidelines and some garde-fou for still growing our sector. The negative side of it is that it has created such a polemic about how we should manage our forest, our energy sector, that to some extent, and for sure, it frightens also some potential users of biomass. So some industry now are really reconsidering the the options for the future for bioenergy because of that kind of polemic. So as I said, we are at a turning point, and I think that, as someone mentioned as well, I think Russell was mentioning this. Now it's time to move from the theory to the practice. I mean, definitely we have to you know, we have hundreds of companies that are higher, that are some larger than 20 megawatt, in fact, according to the directive. And it's not a system for sustainability that can run overnight. I mean, we need learning by doing experience, and we have to start now. Really postponing again and again the implementation is not helping the industry. We need to start really now, and for the industry, where we are contacted with them on a daily basis, this is not greenwashing. And some people are thinking that this is greenwashing. In reality, this will imply a lot of traceability exercise, which is definitely a challenge, which is not existing almost for fossil fuels, but we will do it, we can do it. For the CO2 savings of 70–80% is also challenging. Not all biomass will succeed, so there will be really a selection. And I think that the best, and I will finalize with this, but we will continue and the industry should continue to communicate and educate especially the policymakers that are sometimes, I'm afraid, taking decisions without knowing all the impact and without knowing exactly how the woodworking industry is working, because this is a complicated story with a lot of impact with different sectors. So the lessons learned is for the industry now is that we need to move from the theory to the practice. We are waiting for it, and our communication, the communication is our challenge. Let's say. Thank you. I'm ready for answering any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marc, and thank you all for your presentations and painting the picture. The situation is by no means trivial, as Jean-Marc points out. And I would like to thank the audience for a whole lot of questions that have been actually coming in. And I would like to start with a question to Luc Pelkmans. Luc, a participant is asking, how does bioenergy compete with the other renewables? What's the whole picture? And maybe that gives you the opportunity to quickly tell us about what is the view of the International Energy Agency. What is a net zero? Is their net zero vision for 2050? Please, Luc.
Okay, so unfortunately, I don't have the slides that I can show you, or maybe I can. But anyway, there's quite some developments going on, and the net zero emissions roadmap of the IEA. So we're not from the IEA itself. I mentioned it, so it's IEA Paris who has done that. But they have quite a thorough analysis for this roadmap, which, by the way, is not a projection; it's a roadmap. So quite a lot needs to happen to get there, but so it's not something that will happen from itself. But you see really a lot of evolution in renewables there. The role of biomass in the end in 2050 is considered, I think it's around 18% of total energy supply would be from biomass. So that's quite substantial. You still have some fossils, but fossil needs to be, you need to have some kind of CCS also to compensate for the fossil emissions. There is a massive increase of solar and wind energy, particularly for electricity production. So there's a lot of increase for electricity in all kinds of sectors, with electrification in the transport sector, also in the heating sector, also in industry. So the expectation is that it's almost 3 times the electricity production that we have now that we need in 2050. So that is massive. And the role of biomass in electricity production, I think at the moment it's around 3% of global electricity production comes from biomass. The expectation in 2050 that it would be around 5%. So it's also not massive in the electricity production, but this 5% of something which is 3 times larger also means that, that the electricity production from biomass also needs to increase about 4 times. And a big focus on this electricity production from biomass is going to be the combination with CCS. So it's kind of one of the only solutions in electricity production that provides negative CO2 emissions. So that's really the role of biomass there. And this 5%, it's also to compensate for all the variables that you have with solar and wind. So this is really something well, you also have hydropower to do things that to help in that. But that's a very important role of this 5%. Together with other renewables. So mind that the challenge, as I've shown in one of the opening slides, that fossil is still increasing. So we have to get back this curve down, which is a big challenge, and to replace everything with renewables, also to reduce with energy consumption with energy efficiency measures, which is very crucial, by the way. So it's all a big challenge, and we need kind of everything that we have in the pocket. So I think it's really challenging times, and if we want to get to that net zero emission scenario, it's a lot of action will be needed, including bioenergy, which I mentioned has a role of 18%, which would require, I think we're now around 60 exajoules of biomass, which would go to 100 exajoules of biomass. So it's not a spectacular increase. It requires some extra mobilization, but it's not times 10 or 50 that you have with the other renewables.
Thank you, Luc. And I should add that the IEA has also highlighted that their expectation is way lower than the actual potentials for bioenergy. So there is no threat in that scenario to overuse bioenergy and to move it into an unsustainable way. Yeah. Now, you have mentioned one issue, and that relates to a question here, and that was, again, trying to understand how can Drax produce negative emissions? Ross, can you please try to explain that in a way that is easily understandable, because obviously there are emissions coming out of the stack. So how do you produce negative emissions? How is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first important thing to sort of mention is that we don't set the sort of framework that governs how biomass carbon is treated. You know, that is a convention that has been in place for many decades through the IPCC. And it remains it was reaffirmed, I think, just last year in the latest greenhouse gas inventory update from the IPCC. And put simply, biomass combustion emissions are treated for zero in the energy sector to avoid double counting. They're accounted for in the land use sector. Once a tree is felled for use of bioenergy, it is treated as instantly oxidized. It's gone. And the reason why it's accounted for in the land use sector and not in the energy sector is because of the risk of deforestation. If you set up a system where you are allowing people to take down bits of forest but not account for it until it's much further at the end of the supply chain, that's a big risk that I think a decision was made a good many decades ago that wasn't worth taking. So I've got a quote up there from the IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories in front of me, and this is the guiding principle. It says, if the plant is supplied with biofuels, the corresponding CO2 emissions will be zero. These are already included in the national totals due to treatment in the AFOLU land use sector. So the subtraction of the amount of gas transferred to long-term storage may give negative emissions. May give negative emissions. And that's a very important point, because the challenge for all of us now who believe in reaching a 1.5 degree target, who are pushing hard to get negative emissions as part of that solution, is to really define the sustainability criteria by which we can identify and verify a negative emission as a negative emission. And that is an incredibly important task, which I know the Commission, UK government and others are looking at now, and one in which we would welcome all input from all across sectors to help get right.
I would like to switch your focus a little bit and ask Michaela Morese, how do you see the opportunities for developing economies to use sustainable bioenergy? Where do you see the focus? Where do you see the opportunities that are most eminent and most urgent to be used?
Thank you very much, Christian, for this question. Well, we've worked a lot as an initiative, as an international initiative. We've worked a lot in Africa, for example, and I mentioned in my couple of slides the ECOWAS region. So in developing countries in general, we know that there is a high use of traditional biomass, traditional bioenergy, which we all know is produced and used in an unsustainable manner. So one of the most important tasks and activities that we've been doing is supporting those countries to move from traditional use of bioenergy to a more modern use of bioenergy. That's one important aspect. Then, in light of this, the fact that in many developing countries, they make use of green forest, which is not, of course, sustainable. And we are trying so to organize activities and trainings also at the farm level, smallholder level, in order for them to understand that there are alternatives still using bioenergy, alternative uses of bioenergy that could represent an opportunity also in terms of income for the smallholder families, for example, but at the same time reduce the pressure on forests. And the last point that I could mention is that we have measured the GBEP indicators that I presented in several developing countries, and we've realized that there are some challenges. Some of the indicator performances could indeed be improved. And therefore, this means on one side that many countries, in many situations, bioenergy could be improved. The bioenergy development could be improved. There is a wide range of improvement in terms of sustainability in order to maximize the potential of bioenergy. But it is important to work on sustainability. So this is extremely crucial.
Thank you, Michaela. Fully agree with what you're saying. And I'll switch again the focus to Europe. And I'd like to ask Jean-Marc as well as Ross, if you look now in the last 10 years, what have been the main driving forces for bioenergy to show a significant increase? Because that's what we are having. We're having substantial increases in Europe. We have been really adding to the use of renewable energy in the last decade. So what were the main policy initiatives and what would you like to see in the future? Now, Ross, from a UK perspective, of course, now you're independent, so you can even express more ambitious wishes than we in Europe, because we're still bound to negotiations and differing interests. What is it that determined UK approach would need to bring? Ross.
Yes, I'll avoid commenting on Brexit. I think we've heard a lot of that over the years, but you're quite right in one sense, which is the UK has, should it desire, the opportunity to do things slightly differently, and the UK government here is certainly for the first time in a decade setting out a consultation, a call for evidence on what the future of bioenergy in the UK will be. I mean, it recognises, and I think I'm almost quoting directly here, that biomass is unique in its ability to deliver so many of the decarbonisation services that we will need to meet our climate change targets. How do we best utilise it? But I think going back to what have been the drivers behind the expansion of bioenergy and to get to where we are today, well, I think there are two primary things. One is a commitment to renewable energy, and that commitment being backed up by an investable mechanism, like a contract for difference mechanism. That's been a huge UK success story, first used in the UK and now kind of being picked up and used around the world. This ability for generators to get investment into generating renewable electricity, and also a strong carbon price, a carbon price that pushes fossil fuel generation, even if it's cheaper than renewable generation, off of the merit order. You know, you always want your renewables to dispatch first. That's absolutely essential, and having a sort of stable long-term outlook on the carbon price, so that again investors can see that the value in investing in renewable projects like bioenergy has also been essential. And it's not just been essential for bioenergy, right? It's the same story for wind and solar, which you know, wind in particular has succeeded very much in the UK. So I think those are the real primary drivers in the UK.
Thank you, Ross. Jean-Marc, what's your answer? You're muted. You're muted.
How can I still make that kind of fault after 1 year homework? Sorry for this. I have another angle to explain why our growth was something like between 3 and 5% annually in the last 20 years, in fact. Knowing that the growth is different depending on the sectors, because we have the domestic sector, the industry sector, the utilities, the district heating. You have many kinds of biomass market. But for me, the main driver was the competitiveness, the economic competitiveness of biomass. Biomass remains a cheap fuel. For the moment, we are cheaper than gas, for example, far cheaper than electricity. And this combined with the willingness of cities or industries to become sustainable. When they have that kind of goal and vision, and we will have more and more of them on that vision, that kind of vision, when they study the possibility, I mean, biomass is one of the most logic one in the rural areas. So cities establishing district heating, I mean, they know that heat pumps will be far too expensive for the citizens. I mean, they cannot depend on intermittent renewables. So biomass is the logic answer, and you have so many companies and cities, for example, or even individual houses or buildings that okay, commit to be green, and they logically go for biomass because on top of being green, it's economic for them.
Yeah, I agree with that. I recall that there is this example from the Baltic countries where I think it was Latvia, was it, or Lithuania? I keep confusing them, that were replacing natural gas heated. Yes, Jean-Marc, which one is it?
It's in Lithuania, for example, in 20 years, they moved from 2% biomass to close to 80% biomass now, replacing natural fossil gas. And this is because biomass from Lithuania is more or less 4 times less expensive than imported fossil gas. And the investment for the conversion is higher, but at the end of the day, the citizens in Lithuania are paid 50% less for their heat. 50% less, can you imagine? I mean, so it's, and using indigenous biomass, creating companies, a lot of jobs for the supply and transport logistics of the biomass, the building these biomass plants. So it's a win-win-win-win. I mean, definitely.
I would like to ask Seth. Seth, there are some critics that say the use of bioenergy in large-scale industrial plants is destroying the forests in America. What would you answer to these critics?
I would just say that, you know, the data, over 71 years of data, U.S. Forest Service, forest inventory analysis data shows that is not the case. And in fact, when you provide additional markets for these landowners in the U.S. Southeast, those forests will grow. And the data demonstrates over the past 71 years, year over year, those carbon stocks are increasing, those forests are increasing. The thing that I think is really scary about all of this is that if you take some of these critics' allegations and conclusions and take them to their logical end, which would be, let's take away this market completely for those folks in the US Southeast. If that were to happen, that is what is going to lead to land conversions. If these individuals and families don't have markets for that wood fiber, they will convert it. They will convert it to agricultural use. They will convert it to real estate development use. And when you look at what the IPCC says about, you know, one of the biggest risks that we face from the standpoint of not being able to meet all of these targets, it's deforestation. And in the US Southeast, if you take away those markets, it will lead to deforestation. And so I want to re-emphasize that point, because this is not just a kind of difference of opinion, or the criticism is maybe another way to do things. The criticism, if you take that criticism to its logical end, it will accentuate climate change, which is something we are all trying to mitigate. And so, you know, going back to lessons learned, I also think that that's a point that we need to be making over and over again, because too much is at stake. We can't make that mistake.
Seth, what is the amount or the share of harvested wood in the US Southeast that is actually going to energy?
So for bioenergy within the US, and let me don't have the data in front of me, but I'm recalling from memory, and we actually have a report on our website, www.theucpa.org. If you go to the resources page, it's a forest to market report that was done with the National Alliance of Forest Owners. But for the amount of wood fiber that is harvested on an annual basis, we only account for 0.03% of that fiber. So it's a very, very small amount, but it's an important amount, because in many instances, these small landowners don't have other outlets. And that little bit of extra money that they're able to make on being able to also sell the low-grade wood fiber and not scooping it into a big pile in the middle of the plot of land and burning it without an energy benefit, you know, that really makes a difference.
Right, right. And that's true not only in the US, it's also in other, I recall in Canada, they've been just burning. All of these have been burned. Now they're being transformed into useful pellets and being used to generate energy. And the benefit is very, very obvious. Now let me talk to Luc. Luc, you're a researcher. From your point of view, what are the most important barriers to progress? I mean, we've been talking about being too slow, of being too slow towards climate change mitigation. What do you see as a researcher as the key issues that we need to overcome?
You mean in the bioenergy fields, or?
Absolutely, yes.
Or broadly? I think it all comes down to the business cases, as I mentioned. So we expect a lot, and we expect a lot of growth also in the sector. Also, we hope a lot of growth in the sector. Not only for power and heat, but also in terms of biofuels and then biochemicals also in the future. But it's these business cases which are make or break this evolution. So and a business case comes down to the access to the biomass. So how do you get it there? Is it easy? What as discussed, is all the sustainability requirements behind it? How can you demonstrate it? So actually the industry has to deal with a lot of new things compared with what they were doing with fossil fuels. So if they buy biomass, there's so many things which come around with which makes it kind of difficult also for them to do it. So the business case, you have to, if you go for low carbon energy, you need to be rewarded in some way. So you need to also feel it in your pocket that's there. And I forgot my third point. No, yeah, I missed it a little bit. But the business case is really a very crucial one. Mobilization of biomass, getting rewarded for your carbon. Those are crucial things. And of course, the whole atmosphere which is created, I think it was mentioned by you, Christian, is that yeah, people have to feel comfortable also that this is a solution. They're not going to be criticized too much for it. So that's not what they aim for. So they hope to get some appreciation for what they're doing. And if they're being criticized all the time, that's not something which will help. So we need to really demonstrate that it's a good solution also, and that's pretty critical.
Thank you, Luc. Seth, you want to add something to that?
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Luc. I would just add that, one of the biggest obstacles I think that we face is regulatory uncertainty. What we need is regulatory certainty. This is a very capital-intensive business. We've collectively deployed billions of dollars in the form of plants and ports and all of the infrastructure that Ross was talking about on his slide in his presentation. And I guess I would just cite, we went through the Renewable Energy Directive 2 process in 2018. That has not even been implemented fully yet. And here we are with the European Union, getting ready to propose a RED 3. And I think it's important to note that in 2018, those regulators supposedly sent a signal of market certainty and regulatory certainty to the investment community. Investors have come in, have deployed capital. Those supply chains are now being built out. And I would just urge those regulators to keep whatever the proposed sustainability criteria for solid biomass are in RED 3 to make sure that they are consistent with RED 2, to make sure that RED 2 itself is able to be implemented, because if we don't have that regulatory certainty, the capital just won't be there to build out those supply chains. And I think this goes broader than just the biomass industry. When you look at what Europe, and I'll use Europe as an example, needs, it's going to take $1 trillion to finance the Green New Deal. The World Economic Forum came out with a report last June that showed there will not be enough public sector capital available to fund that. And that by definition means that there will need to be private sector capital. And these investors, these institutional investors, will not deploy this capital unless they have regulatory certainty. And so if biomass, as an example, if that criteria changes in a drastic way, I think you will see the investment community run from Europe, not only from the biomass space, but as it relates to the entire, financing of the Green New Deal. So there's a lot at stake here, and I think it's a very, very important issue.
Thank you, Seth. Now we have to wrap it up. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I would like to ask all of you to make one very brief final statement, and that is, if you look back for the last 10 years, and all of you have been in this sector for longer than that, what has been among the most important learnings that that comes to your mind? Let's start with Ross.
I knew that was going to happen. Michaela wanted to go first. She put her hand up. I'm going to let her go first. I'm going to keep thinking.
Michaela, please, ladies first.
Thank you very much. Well, there are a number of points that I would like to mention. First of all, sustainability has become key, recognized, and trusted. So that's important, because 13 years ago, sustainability was not even possible to be mentioned in some cases, in some contexts. So it's an important step ahead. So recognition of the importance of sustainability. Then recognition of the country and context specificity of bioenergy development. So each country, each context is completely different, and we cannot apply the same kind of approach everywhere because it doesn't fit everywhere at the same in the exactly the same type of approach. And then I agree with what said that regulatory frameworks, policy stability of policies is essential. And in order to do this, sustainability assessment and feasibility studies are essential in order to flow relevant information to policymakers so that policymakers could set regular policies, stable policies, and these would represent an incentive also for sustainable investment. So those are my points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michaela. Ross.
I can go now. No, I think Michaela's point on sustainability is absolutely vital. I think, you know, if there's one thing from my background in politics and communication that is so important, is to be able to communicate complex ideas clearly, to be able to demonstrate the impact that you're having is good, and to be able to reach audiences with what you are trying to communicate. I think part of the frustration that we feel in the industry when NGO criticism arrives and it's ill-informed or it's wrong is that I haven't met anybody in this industry who doesn't consider themselves an environmentalist, who isn't here in this industry trying to displace fossil fuels because they believe passionately in renewable energy and they believe passionately in the mobilization of sustainable biomass. So I think, you know, it's incumbent on us to keep on trying to build relationships, to keep on communicating clearly, to keep on demonstrating that what we're doing and what we're trying to do is on the right side of history, and that's only going to become more important as the need to meet our climate change targets intensifies.
Thank you, Ross. Jean-Marc.
Yeah, along the same the same topic, I also have an issue with sustainability. It's increasingly more complicated to have a holistic view on the sustainability, at least in the Brussels debate. I mean, because in fact, for sustainability, it's not just environment, but you have three pillars: people, planet, profit, and even many other sustainability principles, as we see with GBEP. It's a question of compromise at the end. There are different ways to manage the forest to maximize the benefit to one or the other pillars, and we cannot sacrifice the people dimension, the employment dimension, by leaving the forest untouched in Europe. And it's a pity that these debates are not balanced anymore, and they are not rational anymore, and they are much too emotional. And going out of this, even if we produced an enormous amount of fact sheets and statistical reports, of hundreds of pages of statistical reports to demonstrate by facts, it is not sufficient. It's really a challenge. It's really a challenge for us, and that is becoming more and more important. So that's why I was saying that we are at a turning point now, because if we don't succeed, I don't know, probably fossil fuel will win this battle, maybe.
Luc, what's your view?
Okay. I want to pick up the last point that Jean-Marc has noted. We have seen, well, learnings from the biofuel story. which was, you had a debate coming up in 2009 on indirect land use change. It took until 2017 to get something out from the Commission. And at the same time, biofuels has stalled. There was no growth in biofuels anymore, and there was a continuing growth of fossil fuels in transport. So that's the back thing. So if you make it difficult, if you don't have clarity, you just continue what you're doing. So you just continue. We've seen these developments also in countries where biomass was debated and was some blocking of it. And we just in the past 5 years we see a tremendous growth of natural gas in the energy sector. So that's a downside. So if you do nothing, if you say, well, it's too difficult, it's just fossil. So that's I think that's an important message. What I would like to also point out is that we have to stress more that that bioenergy and biomass is not just producing energy. It's not just producing a kilowatt hour of electricity or heat. You have to see it in balance with all the other renewables in the whole energy system. So I think you have to value much more on providing this stability, flexibility, dispatchability, and also what Jean-Marc has been saying, the social side, so the employment side, the opportunities in rural areas. I think those are points which will come much more, and also the negative emissions part. So how much, apart from energy production, how much do you contribute to actually putting CO2 in the ground or in the soil also? So keeping the whole balance, and in the sustainability framework also integrating biomass harvest in kind of a system of land management, sustainable land management. What's also important is that we've seen the pressure from the bioenergy side and biofuel side towards different countries with the sustainability requirements that they have. We've seen that this has kind of pushed also sustainability practices, more sustainable practices in different countries for sugarcane production, also for palm oil production, by the way, and also it's a driver for more sustainable forestry. So it's not something that, and that's something that you have to be careful with, and all the critics that there are, that they say, oh, there's too many risks involved, so don't do it. It's actually because of the risks that we know that there are, and all the things that you can do to mitigate those risks, that's actually helping things on the field. And that's also an important message.
Thank you, Luc. Seth.
Thanks, Christian. I would just briefly say, two things. Number one, we've learned that data and evidence continuously win the day in the policy arena. Additionally, research, and I would just hope that as we go through this next iteration of policymaking at the EU level, at the member state level, in Asia, that the policymakers are able to push through some of the hyperbole out there, some of the white noise and unfounded criticism, and actually look at the data, look at the evidence, look at the science, and rely on that. So I think that would be number one. And then two, just to echo again, when we're talking about biomass and whether or not you use it, the stakes are very high. It's not a technology like wind or solar, where if you say, well, we're not going to use solar here, we'll go use something else. Well, there won't necessarily be a harmful impact to that. There just won't be something additive. Where when you're talking about biomass, if you eliminate biomass, you are going to take away markets, and the elimination of those markets will lead to deforestation, and that's obviously a very bad thing. So again, the stakes are very high, and I'm optimistic about our place in helping to fight climate change, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody today.
Thank you very much, Seth. Yes, it's time to wrap up. I think almost everything has been said. I just want to reiterate one issue, and that is the issue of urgency. I mean, we have heard in Canada it's 46 degrees centigrade. It's ridiculous. I mean, the climate disaster is on its way, and I think what we need to do is we need to join forces towards mitigating climate change. And that includes, of course, and most importantly, the forces with the environmental movement, with the environmental organizations. So my pledge is to you, please, let's get into talking about how to do it properly, how to do it sustainably, and let's stop campaigning on very, very thin arguments and mainly on emotions about burning trees. It's time to really take action on climate change, and let's do that together. Thank you all participants, and we'll meet again in September with the next issue of this series of webinars. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.